Welcome to the Prairie Files, a true crime podcast. This is episode 2, Officer Down. Please note, trigger warning. This podcast contains graphic depictions of real-life violence. It may be alarming to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. It was a blistering, hot day on June 25th, 1990 in Edmonton, Alberta, that nobody living at the time will ever forget. The Edmonton Oilers had just won their 5th Stanley Cup and the city was still buzzing. At the time, Brian Mulroney was our Prime Minister and a tumultuous period was starting in the Middle East. Iraq was about to invade Kuwait, which would be the start of the US-Iraq conflict. The wall in Germany had just come down, and the Hubble Space Telescope was also just launched. It was the first day back after a weekend, the dreaded Monday. The streets were bustling and another work week had just started. At around 1:45 p.m., the Edmonton police were doing undercover surveillance on a small maroon car with 2 males who were known to police. The car was a Dodge Colt, and it was traveling through Edmonton from the northeast to the central part of Edmonton. It pulled up to the Scotiabank branch at 10702 124th Street, but circled the block a couple times before parking in behind the branch. It's not known if the police surveillance team lost the car at some point, but they may well have. The 2 suspects were originally just going to scope out the bank, when the passenger, most likely high on heroin, mentioned how easy it looked. Now was the time. Wielding a loaded, sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun, nylons on his face, and a red sports bag, one of the males exited the car and burst into the bank. Meanwhile, the driver waited outside in the idling maroon Colt. The Edmonton Journal spoke with an employee of the Scotiabank who didn't want to be named, and she said, "Somebody came in and asked us to hit the floor. I don't know anything after that," she said. "I'm very upset." She didn't really see what happened, and she was very scared and almost blacked out. In the book Deadmonton, written by Pamela Roth, which I think you should all have a read, she describes the heated moment when a bank teller named Sonia was helping a customer with a certified check, and a man with nylons over his head burst through the door. He told everyone to get down on the floor. Crouching on the ground near her teller's wicket, Sonia looked up to see the robber leap over the counter and land next to her. With a mean voice, he demanded she open the cash drawers. Sonia went on to say, "I stood up and he brought the gun to my face. I was frozen and couldn't move, and he said, 'Let's move it, baby.'" She did what she was told. In the meantime, Sonia and another teller were able to sneak marked bills into the red sports bag. After getting the cash drawer emptied into the bag, the robber demanded access to the vault. The employees frantically told him it was not possible. Then he became agitated, vaulted back over the counter, and ran for the doors. At that moment, quick thinking on the part of the employees made it possible for them to hit a secret switch to activate a surveillance system that took 2 quick snapshots of the shotgun-wielding man. Banks were being robbed at an alarming rate in 1990, so the EPS set up a special task force to try and combat the problem. On this specific day, they were stationed at the Royal Bank across the street to the south from the Scotiabank on 124th Street and 107th Avenue. 2 undercover policemen were inside watching the Royal Bank that had just been robbed violently twice in the previous week, when undercover officers witnessed a masked man armed with a shotgun run from the Scotiabank across the street and leap into the back of a small maroon-colored Dodge Colt. They then peeled out, headed north on 124th Street. One of the keen officers stationed in the Royal Bank across the street did notice the car beforehand, circling the bank, and was aware of it, so he kept an eye on the branch. The robbery suspect stayed in the back seat laying down on the floor so he would not be detected by police or witnesses. However, the police were hot on their trail. Multiple police vehicles were in pursuit, so they kept their distance. Reports state some officers thought it was a lone driver, while others knew it was two suspects in the car. There was a lot of miscommunication here. The suspect's car would eventually enter an alley between 124th Street and 123rd Street, south of 117th Avenue, after driving up and down alleys to avoid capture. A specialized tactical unit used for responding to a high-risk crisis situation or dangerous vehicle stops was called out and was there within minutes. At the time, this prestigious tactical unit had 28 members, and Squad C was in the area. It was 4 officers in separate cars from Squad C that would attempt to make the stop of the small maroon car once it was found. One of the 4 tactical officers was Ezio Ferrone, a 33-year-old 10-year veteran of the Edmonton Police Force. Ezio was alone in his yellow police cruiser following team lead Detective Schreiber, who was just up ahead, when out of the corner of his eye, Ezio saw what appeared to be the suspect's vehicle in an alley about a half a block down. So he took a quick right, south into the alley just off of 117th Avenue, as his team lead continued on. Now at this point, it's most likely that the team lead lost sight of Ezio because there was a lot of sewer construction going on. The Maroon Colt was eventually stopped in the alley, blocked by construction pointing south. Officer Ferrone pulled in behind the suspect's car. The city was installing new sewer pipes in the area, and there were quite a few construction workers and a lot of heavy equipment all over the place. Ezio immediately got out of the cruiser, with his adrenaline pumping, possibly thinking there was only one suspect, as reported by radio. He yelled to the suspect to get out of the car, with his hands up. With his service pistol carefully pointed at the suspect, and his body shielded behind the door, he continued to speak to the suspect and yell commands. With the suspect's hands held high, he exited the vehicle and was itching towards the driveway of a house just in the alley, with his back turned to Ezio. Ezio slowly crept towards the suspect. Moments later, Ezio's and Edmontonians' lives would change forever. 2 loud blasts would ring out. The second suspect, who was lying down in the back seat, swung open the back door and had just ambushed Ezio by shooting him from the back seat of the car. First, a blast to the upper abdomen, then a second shot to his head. Baseball-sized wounds, along with many other smaller pellet wounds, would leave Ezio to bleed out on the hot asphalt. The shots fired from the 12-gauge shotgun would be fatal. Ezio Ferrone, 33, a beloved police officer, was murdered in cold blood by 2 thugs who had just stolen a couple $1,000s. This is where the story gets a little murky. There are numerous accounts of what happened after this that contradict one another. Statements from police, media, witnesses, and the court do not always tell the same story. After the shotgun blast disabled Ezio, the shooter jumped into the driver's side, behind the wheel, and peeled out around the construction, heading south down the alley, past the gravel trucks, cutting across a grassy area, and then took off down 116th Avenue east. The other suspect dropped his hands after the first shot and had zero reaction, almost like his soul was gone, and his senses didn't even register the loud blast that had just rang out. He then began to run south down the alley without even thinking about what had just happened. Dale Wells, a gravel truck operator, told the Edmonton Journal he saw the officer approach the suspect driver. Wells heard 2 shots in quick succession, but didn't see the officer fall. He jumped from his truck and approached the officer to try and assist him, but it was quite obvious there was nothing he could do. Ezio was laying on his right side and had lost a lot of blood, his service revolver still clutched in his hand. The officer never had a chance, Wells said. Ray Desjardins, who lived in an apartment building at 11615 124th Street, said he came out running to his balcony after hearing the shots at about 2:05 p.m. on that horrible Monday. Then he ran down to where Ezio was lying. Blood was all over his face, and he was really messed up bad, Desjardins said. It's really a scary thing to happen right in your neighborhood, especially when you have kids, he said. Other tenants were on their balconies looking in the alley, trying to figure out what was going on and what all the commotion was about. It was a complete circus. People screaming and yelling everywhere. Other workers in the area, also working on the storm sewers, gave statements and talked to media. The first thing we heard was 2 shots, said foreman Lonnie P. He said he looked up and saw one of the laborers running south down the alley along with another man behind him. One of Lonnie's lead truckers was waiting in the alley and decided to move out of the way as the man running had a gun. But I think what he meant to say was the man in the car had the gun. But media reports seemed to differ. Near the end of the alley was a backhoe operator, Ken Campbell, and he had heard the foreman yelling to stop the car, so he backed up his backhoe to try and block the small car from getting through, but it whizzed by and cut across a grassy patch before he could do anything. Meanwhile, other workers, such as Mitch P., were knee-deep in mud when he jumped out of the ditch to take chase after the long-haired suspect that was fleeing south on foot. This is where I'll bring up the differences in the story. Some information I've obtained says the shooter got out of the car and took off, but the court records state it was the shooter that jumped into the car and took off. So we're going to go with that. Some witnesses say they saw a man running in a bright green shirt with a gun, which doesn't make a lot of sense. I think sometimes when adrenaline is rushing, you don't always remember everything after. Other witnesses said they saw the driver, a long-haired man running south in the alley. So we know that's not the shooter, as the driver was the one with long hair. After running south, he then cut west to 124th Street and back up 124th Street, going north until he ran into an apartment block on the northeast corner of 117th Avenue and 124th Street. Lance, an 18-year-old man who lived nearby, said he was sitting on his doorstep when he saw the 2 suspects. One, a man running up 124th Street, looking very suspicious, adjusting his hat to cover his eyes, and he was looking around like something just happened. The other suspect, he said, fled in a maroon car east down 116th Ave. I personally talked to another person in the area who was there that day. Her name is Charlene. She says she'll never forget that day. She was staying at her boyfriend's apartment across the street from the shooting on the west side of 124th Street. She remembers it being an extremely hot day. She was doing her hair and makeup, getting ready for work, when she heard what sounded like 2 firecrackers. Her boyfriend ended up going down to see what was going on after hearing the shots and even more commotion. Hiding behind a car for safety, he saw the long-haired man in the fluorescent green shirt running up 124th Street. Other workers were in full chase, but nobody seemed to be worried about the gun other than the boyfriend. I think nowadays not many people would pursue a perceived armed man, but it's also possible the construction workers knew that he wasn't the suspect with the gun. Police arrived quickly as other chasing construction workers turned the corner, heading up 124th. They started pointing to the suspect, pointing frantically in his direction as he was fleeing up 124th Street and disappeared into the building. According to the Edmonton Journal, a woman who lived in a basement suite of the building where the long-haired suspect ran into yelled to the chasing construction workers, "What's going on here?" And a worker said, "A man just shot a cop," and described the man. That's when she gasped and said, "He just ran down my hallway." At around 2:30, police surrounded the building. 2 city blocks were shut down, and in all directions. A manhunt had started. Now, it's not certain how he got away, but for a few hours, he escaped capture until he was captured in Clairview, near 135th Avenue and 38th Street at around 5 p.m. that same day. In his possession was some ammunition that matched that of the killer's weapon. There was no mention of how he escaped capture at the building on 124th Street. If anybody out there knows, I'd love to hear from you. Just after the maroon getaway car fled, the shooter had almost gotten away until a heroic officer was somehow able to apprehend the shooter just blocks away from the killing at 113th Avenue and 122nd Street. The officer, later named Detective Ernie Schraber, who earlier was ahead of Ezio in a car and a part of the four-man task force himself, noticed the shooter on foot walking down the street just a short distance from a maroon car. Without any hesitation, Ernie had him at gunpoint within seconds. After cuffing him, they frisked him and they found about $3,800 cash tucked in his jeans and his waistband. 17 of those bills matched the serial numbers that Sonia had put in the bag earlier at the Scotiabank robbery. Another officer started looking in the car where they discovered a wallet containing a driver's license and an Alberta Healthcare in the name of Cruz. Later on, forensic teams found both suspects' prints in the car, nylons, and a duffel bag with $187 was found. A matchbox with one of the suspects' prints was also found in the car. Around the abandoned car, yards were searched and more money was found. About $2,000 was recovered from a couple backyards in the area. Some of those bills matched the stolen money. They ended up finding the shotgun under a barbecue at a home nearby. An elderly woman who did not want to be named remembers when the driver was captured near her house. She said it got a little crazy. The policeman yelled at her to stay inside her house while they arrest the suspect. The man laying face down on the ground is a sight she won't forget, especially after she learned what the man had done. My heart sank when I realized later that day what he did. I was really sad for the officer's family, she said. Back at the scene, police were starting to show up in waves. More than 30 police cars were reported being in the alley and surrounding areas. Ezio's friend and colleague, Sergeant Colley, arrived at the scene. I went over and pulled the blanket back, and I recognized the man as an officer who had worked for me, Ezio Ferrone. I had the task of telling members, please stop calling him. Constable Ferrone is not coming. Members of the EPS were completely devastated, he said. After the medical examiner had arrived to take Ezio away, police remained on scene until the next day to continue their investigation. However, even after the police were gone, a large void remained. A massive hole in the community was left. It was very traumatizing and life-altering for some witnesses I spoke to. The two suspects later that day initially charged with first-degree murder: Albert Folston, 27, the getaway driver, and Jerry Cruz, the trigger man, 23, of Edmonton, both with fresh needle marks on their arms, were behind bars within hours. The community was safe for the time being. Jerry Cruz was eventually convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life with no parole, while Folston, the getaway driver, was sentenced to 20 years for manslaughter. Before the trial, the court ordered both suspects to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. Forensic psychologist Otto Katsky initially took the stand to give testimony that both Cruz and Folston most likely have mental illness. However, they would eventually be cleared to face charges. Jerry Cruz, the shooter, was from Nova Scotia. starting out his criminal life in Halifax breaking and entering. He left home and became a transient at the age of 15. He lived in and out of foster homes before that. He was already addicted to drugs and alcohol when he became entrenched in the criminal lifestyle. He moved out west in the mid-80s, and in 1987 in Calgary, he was arrested and sentenced 4 years in prison for a crime spree that included break and enter, drug offenses, illegally entering a dwelling, possession of a firearm, assault with a weapon, and obstructing justice. While in prison for the Ferrone killing, Cruz complained a lot about mistreatment because he had killed a cop, and a popular one at that. In 1993, at the Edmonton Max, a bunch of policies were changed that angered many of the inmates. A gang was formed to resist the policies called the Lucifer's Legion. Cruz was identified as one of the leaders of this group, which he adamantly denies. This group trashed a kitchen, having a massive food fight in one instance, and in another instance, he was observed throwing urine and feces into a segregation unit. He also breached his cell by breaking the interior and exterior windows. He was also accused of attempting to bring in contraband. After all this, the warden recommended that he be involuntarily transferred to one of Canada's supermax prisons, in his special handling unit, also known as the SHU, at the Saskatchewan Penitentiary, located a kilometer west of the city of Prince Albert. Fast forward about 9 years later, on June 3rd, 2002, he was involved in a riot where a fire was started at the Donnacona Penitentiary, which is a maximum security prison in Quebec. After the incident, he said he couldn't understand the French-speaking guards and was later handed a 20-day sentence of no TV. I thought this was pretty funny. Jerry Cruz ended up meeting a woman who he started a relationship with, who was working at the Alberta Law Courts in Edmonton. I believe he met her while he was serving at the Max in Edmonton. Jerry Cruz was on parole at the time of the killing, and he was actually due to meet with his parole officer at 3 p.m. that same day of the robbery. After being in jail for 27 years, he became eligible for parole in 2017. His whereabouts today is unknown. Word on the street is he is still in a BC institution, but he may be walking among us today. His release would probably get some media attention, so I'd be surprised if he was out. But let me know if you hear anything. Albert Fulston, the getaway driver, was born in 1963 and was from North Battleford, Saskatchewan. He grew up under terrible conditions. His father would make him and his brother fight until bloodied for his own entertainment. Albert Fulston's brother Dean was also in and out of jail his entire life. They both did time together at one point at the Edmonton Max. Fulston has been in and out of jail his entire life. In total, he did 30 years and was released 51 different times. And each time he was released, he did not follow any of the parole obligations, not even once. I don't want to get into too much, as it just goes on and on and on with Fulston, and he doesn't deserve the attention. There seems to be a lot of information about Fulston over Cruz, which is kind of weird, because he wasn't even the trigger man. Legendary crime reporter and journalist Byron Christopher wrote a funny line on his blog. He met both Fulston and Cruz at the Edmonton Max, where he said Fulston later to make parole and, like his cocaine, blow it. Byron said, "He struck me as someone wanting attention. I interrupted a gathering of about a dozen lifters sitting on chairs in one of the meeting rooms. Fulston seized the opportunity to rub the bald head of a colleague, glancing my way to see if I'd noticed him." Jerry Cruz was more the thoughtful of the two. Strange as that may sound, because he was the executioner. You could sit down and have a talk with Cruz, not so much with Fulston. who seemed to be scattered. The result of too much narcotics, perhaps. There's a reason that stuff's called dope, Byron said. For his role in the Ezio murder, Fulson was charged with manslaughter, weapons charges, and robbery. After appealing the first-degree murder charge, which was initially denied, he got a new lawyer, and on April 26, 1991, Fulson got his murder charge changed to manslaughter because of the work of his attorneys. The judge ruled there was scintilla of evidence to prove his intent to murder the officer. He argued he wasn't the shooter and had no idea Cruz would murder the officer. The charge of murder was reduced because of the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in R versus Logan and R versus Martineau in 1990, as well as other cases tried in the Supreme Court of Canada. These were all previous cases in Ontario where first-degree murder was changed to second-degree murder or manslaughter because of intent or lack of it. The appeal was complex and got into intent and whether Fulson knew Cruz was going to kill and whether he set a trap by misleading Ezio as he walked away from the car. Albert Fulson was given statutory release in 2009. Finally, after a few failed attempts, he was paroled. This caused a massive rift on all fronts, and the Edmonton Police Chief, Mike Boyd, wrote a letter to the chairman of the parole board in Ottawa. But nothing could be done, and his release was imminent. Since being released, Fulson has repeatedly violated his terms of conditions. He has also been charged with numerous additional offenses, including uttering threats, attempted housebreak, possession of a weapon, multiple breaches, impaired driving, and possession of stolen property. He was also involved in a mugging. In March of 2016, police were called to a northeast Edmonton bungalow, and inside the house they discovered the body of a man officers have hated for years. Edmonton Police Association President Maurice Brodeur confirmed that Albert Fulson, 53, died of an apparent drug overdose, surrounded by drug paraphernalia.
Tuesday, he was found dead in this Edmonton home. Sources say it was a drug overdose.
He's not going to ever hurt anybody ever again, and including himself.
Verone's fellow officers, now mostly retired, want Edmonton to remember their friend and co-worker, not the man who helped cut his life short. Quinn Oler, Global News.
Fulson's death provided a great sense of closure for many of those involved. To this day, his Facebook page is still active. I don't think I've ever seen a more evil-looking human. Days after the murder of Ezio Ferrone, more questions were being asked about why he was alone. Previously, groups were already lobbying for a two-constable tandem because of an officer in Edmonton. Constable Jeffrey Wilkes was stabbed in the neck during an interaction with a criminal. So this incident really put the lobbying effort into a higher gear. At the time, doubling every patrol with 2 officers would be astronomical. So just before Ezio's incident, they tried to make new policies to increase safety for the officers instead of doubling them. This proved to be fatal. Despite an EPS policy that requires officers to notify others by radio before leaving their cars, especially alone in high-risk situations, Ezio did not follow these rules. But in the heat of the moment, we don't know what happened or exactly why he felt compelled to leave his cruiser. He probably felt safer with his gun drawn behind his door and a single suspect in his sights. Why didn't he radio? We don't know why he acted so bravely. Unfortunately, it ended badly. The police chief at the time, Doug McNally, said he thinks Ferrone had no choice and was forced into the situation. McNally also said, when asked if a second officer would have made any difference, "I suppose we could if ourselves to death with a question like that. Perhaps if 2 constables had been in the car, we would be talking about 2 dead constables instead of 1. Or perhaps it would have made a difference. Ross Harvey, an MP for Edmonton East, wrote a letter to the Governor General, Pierre Cadieux, demanding an immediate federal investigation into Ferron's killing. The National Parole Board also launched an investigation into their procedures. This case really pushed for change on a lot of fronts. We even see the changes today as the safety of officers is at its highest it's ever been. Now I'd like to take some time to talk a little bit about Ezio Ferron as the person, and not just the officer who was killed. Ezio was born on April 19th, 1957. He started out his policing career in Delta, BC, where he was a reserve police officer. But because they weren't hiring full-time officers, he ended up applying with the Edmonton Police Service and then moved to Edmonton after a successful campaign. Colleagues and friends loved him, from paying fines for down-and-out lawbreakers that he knew just needed a break, to checking in on people just at the right times in their life.
He's one of those people that drew people to him just because of his personality. He's always willing to help you out with whatever you needed.
You know, Ez was the type of guy that everybody wanted to be a partner with. And I think guys fought over who's going to be working with Ez. That's the type of guy he was.
These are men and women who strap on an identity of that of law enforcement, who have to go out and willingly and on a volunteer basis put themselves in harm's way.
Ez was a man of honor. He believed in good. He believed in doing something for others. That was at his core belief. That was how he was brought up.
You know, I was really fortunate the fact that I could work a patrol car with him, walk the beat with him. And like I mentioned, he treated others like how he'd like to be treated.
Man, I don't think I can recall a time either that he was in a bad mood, or if he was in a bad mood, he hit it really well. He might have been kind of, he gets upset, but doesn't let it drag him down. He was, or drag anybody else down.
When Ezzy passed, and it's been a long time now, 25 years, the Edmonton police family put its arms around everyone, particularly the Ferrons, and took them into their warm embrace. They have never forgotten that, the family or the police family. They have embraced them, and it's for life.
Every class runs to the Ezio Memorial Park by the High Level Bridge, I think at the last week of their class before graduation. That's a great way to keep his memory alive, and for people to remember this is a dangerous job sometimes. And there are people out there that want to hurt us.
There's going to be days, and there was for him. I can remember sitting on the couch talking many times about days where he would say, why do I do this job? And he'd come to the conclusion, I do it because of the guy next to me. I do it for the girl to the right of me, and I do it for the people we want to help. Not to remember is like leaving somebody there, like leaving them behind, and that doesn't honor them.
He left a mark on many people's lives. He was just a really good dude. You couldn't find anyone on this planet who had a bad thing to say about Ezio. Even people in jail that he had put away would say good things about him. He was just very well respected. In 2015, Sergeant Qualley would tell the Edmonton Sun that it seems like just yesterday that Edmonton City Police Officer Constable Ezio Ferron died in his arms. Sergeant Colley, now retired, was Ferron's sergeant, helped Ezio get into the tactical unit. Sergeant Bruce Cruikshank was a former member of Ezio's task force in 1990 and said he was a happy guy, a terrific person. He got along with everyone. It's a tragic loss. Everybody is feeling it. He said it was more like a loss of a family member, not a work associate. And he never missed a birthday, said Staff Sergeant Hugh Richards. Once you made a friend of Ezio's, you made a friend for life. These are just a few of the hundreds of quotes from colleagues. He was truly loved. Many people were affected, and multiple places of worship even held masses and gatherings to honor the slain officer. He really wanted good in this world. A lot of people today are just coasting through life in their own little bubbles, with not a care for the person next to them. We need more people like Ezio. Ezio Ferrone was laid to rest on June 29th, 1990. His service was at Edmonton's most beautiful church, St. Joseph's Cathedral Basilica, in the downtown area. Hundreds attended, and thousands more around the city mourned. Ezio's casket was carried into St. Joseph's by an honor guard, followed by his mother Elsa, brother Paul, and sister Joanne. An amazing procession also lined city streets for blocks that day in Edmonton. He was the third police officer in Edmonton's history to be killed in the line of duty. Constable Frank Beavers, who was 50 years old at the time, was confronted in 1918 on October 17th by a gunman who shot him in the chest and then fled. Beavers died a short time later and was the city's first police officer killed in the line of duty. On October 30th, 1919, as the world was rebuilding after the First World War, Police Constable William Nixon was shot while on parole outside a cafe on 101 Street and 104 Avenue, downtown Edmonton. Then Ezio was killed in 1990. So there was quite a gap between the officers being killed, and it was the first time anyone in Edmonton had ever imagined something like this could happen. I mean, no police officer had been killed in the line of duty for 70 years. Unfortunately, tragedy would strike Edmonton again. Just after the 25th anniversary of Ezio's death, Constable Daniel Woodall, a 35-year-old hate crimes investigator, was shot and killed outside a home while executing a criminal harassment warrant on June 8, 2015, on the city's West End. Two years after his death, a park officially opened, along with a statue that was made by Canadian sculptor Danik, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Mozdzensk. The park is located at 11004 97th Avenue in Edmonton. The park hosts services in memory of the Edmonton police officer killed 3 decades ago, along with other officers who were slain in the line of duty. Other events such as weddings are held there, and it's a hot spot for watching the annual fireworks display put on by Edmonton on Canada Day and New Year's Eve. I come by every day and say hello to the guy, Oliver resident Emil Tobias told CTV News, referencing the statue of Constable Ferrone in the downtown River Valley. I spoke to many people of all walks that were affected by this. It is one of Edmonton's darkest stories, but at the same time, sharing the story of Ezio as a person has made many people happy. The death of Ezio paved way for numerous changes made to the procedural policy for single officer patrols and even led to the increased number in officers who wore bulletproof vests. In my eyes, the most important change happened because of the huge push from the Edmonton Police Spouses Association. Their lobbying efforts led to making major changes when it came to benefits and supports offered for officers and their family. This has left a lasting legacy. Back in 1990, mental health was still in the closet. It was thought as being taboo, or even vilified if talked about. You were basically weak if you spoke about it, or tried to seek help. A perfect example of how it was back in 1990 was Officer Colley recalls telling the Edmonton Sun after Ezio was murdered When I went back into work the following morning, the superintendent that I was working with called me into his office, and his exact words to me I'll never forget. He says, "Oh, you're a tough bugger. You'll do okay. Now get back to work." That was my counseling, he said. Luckily, things have changed, and officers have a lot more supports in place for themselves and their families. PTSD is very real, and many first responders deal with very real symptoms. If you're interested, there's a great resource at www.firstrespondersfirst.ca. If you or someone you know is suffering from mental illness, please seek help. You can contact the mental health hotline at 780-482-4357. The distress line provides confidential, non-judgment, short-term crisis intervention, emotional support, and resources to people in crisis or distress. They also support family, friends, and caregivers of people in crisis. Rest in peace, Ezio. I'd like to end this story with Ezio's beautiful memorial. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.